Hola a todos y como habíamos anunciado aquí vemos con el segundo podcast con Keila Belús y no os lo vais a perder porque vamos a hablar de pronunciación y de cultura como si fueran algo que podemos trabajar como una ciencia, porque lo es. Y es que la oratoria internacional y la comunicación a nivel internacional es algo que muchos de nosotros no nos han enseñado, ni en el cole ni en la universidad, en ningún lado. Pero en este podcast os vamos a dar una introducción para que empecéis a saber de qué va esto, cómo puede mejorar vuestras vidas, sobre todo en la parte profesional muchísimo, porque muchos de vosotros estáis intentando dar ese salto a trabajar a nivel internacional, a empezar a liderar equipos, imagínate, donde hay muchísimas personas de otras culturas. Especialmente existe la cultura de Estados Unidos. Tenemos aquí a una coach de pronunciación y comunicación del estado de Nueva York, así que imaginaros. Así que Keila Belús, te voy a dar paso porque vamos a hablaros, además de no solo de qué va esto, de esta habilidad, sino que os vamos a traer ejemplos con no una, sino dos actrices que han trabajado mucho su voz, por un lado Grace Kelly, por otro lado Meghan Markle, así que vamos a ver muchísimos aspectos con ejemplos prácticos para que entiendas cómo a ti te puede ayudar a entrenarte de esta forma. Y ahora eso sí, lo vamos a hacer en inglés. Además yo voy a hacer un poco el ejemplo como española, ¿vale? Hispanohablante de cómo yo he trabajado mi voz para comunicarme en inglés internacional en una variante estándar. Me inspiro mucho en todo el tema Hollywood, en todo el tema, bueno, yo consumo mucho contenido de inglés americano y ha sido mucho a través de crear un hábito de comunicación. Entonces también tenemos a la perspectiva de Keila para ver un poco cómo nos puede ayudar esto para sentirnos como con más confianza a la hora de comunicarnos en este tipo de entornos. Así que si eres un profesional con un nivel intermedio, que estás cansado de probarlo todo y nada te funciona, a la hora sobre todo de liderar, ¿vale? Si estás en un puesto pues, de manager, que siendo en ese puesto de management y notas que este es como un poco el bloqueo, el obstáculo, ¿vale? O si estás emprendiendo y estás empezando a tener que hacer muchas presentaciones, muchas reuniones y ves que te está limitando. Este puede ser la solución y la clave para que des ese paso, ese salto a nivel internacional. Así que lo vamos a hacer en inglés y lo que necesitas es un nivel intermedio para seguirnos. Y si no, no te preocupes que va a ir con subtítulos en español. Pero venga, atrévete, que este va a ser un podcast con un montón de tips de esta habilidad súper importante en el mundo internacional en el que vivimos. Hi, Keila. Welcome back. Here we
Hi,
are.
good to be back again. I love it. And I'm very excited about today because pronunciation is one of my favorite topics to speak about, and how it's perceived culturally is very interesting, because of my own experience changing, in my case, my Spanish voice over time and doing it as an adult and realizing that I had a choice and I could change and adapt and mold my voice based on what I needed and what I wanted in certain moments. It was a very big realization for me. So once I realized that pronunciation is something that is scientific, it has a certain science behind the sounds and how they're made and when people use them and why and how they connect us as people, all of that can be broken down. So you don't have to be a wizard at imitating people or super good at naturally shadowing. You just have to know what the formula is and be able to follow it. So I'm excited to talk about some of those examples today.
That's incredibly interesting that there is a science that we can follow in order to help us adapt, improve our communication. I think many of us as Spanish speakers, we are not aware, maybe because we didn't have this in our education, that we could adapt the way we communicate and that this is important. And there is an element we're going to talk about a lot in this podcast, that it's authenticity and how this is authentic if we are changing the way we communicate, how it's important to adapt to different audiences, and how this relates to our pronunciation and our voice. And also, there are many actors that do this work with communication coaches and working in their oratory overall, but many professionals, they don't think about working on their voice or their pronunciation, when actually it's key to develop our confidence working in this type of environments. What are your takes on these aspects? And why do you think many people, like many Spanish professionals, they are not aware of how important it is to work in how they sound?
First of all, I'll touch on the point of authenticity, because since it'll come up a lot and people have different variations of definitions of authenticity, I'll say mine. I like to keep definitions super simple. I don't think we need to make anything overly complicated. I think keeping things super simple in communication has been one of the things that has made it easiest for me to become a better communicator. So for me, the idea of being authentic is just being real. Being real will change for you based on the moment of life that you're in, the professional situation you're in, and overall the audience that you're speaking to. So what is real for me, or the best way to communicate when I'm speaking to a child versus speaking to a colleague versus speaking to someone I just met on the street, are completely different. So they can be different versions or realities of authenticity that I choose to share. And the way that our voice changes over time can also feel like something that people get very almost threatened by personally, the idea of changing the sound of their voice, because they feel like, well, I don't want to not sound authentic. I don't want people to think that I'm being fake. I don't want people to think that I'm pretending to be American or British or whatever it is. But in different moments of your life, and as you grow, you're going to grow as a person. So your version of authentic will change. What's real for you will change over time. And the way you communicate will change over time if you are growing and learning as a communicator. So if over time you find that you're working more and more with a specific variety or profile of person, then maybe it makes sense and you have a nudge, you feel an urge, a desire to go towards that style of pronunciation. And in your case, you obviously were in love with all of the American cultural things and music and film and podcasts. So you had a very obvious path to go towards. I had a very mixed experience with Spanish from the beginning, first learning the first couple of years from Latin American professors, and then having all of my social and real life experiences happening in Spain in the summers in between. So I had a very interesting mix of accents. We're going to talk about two examples of people today, as Anna mentioned. First, Grace Kelly will be the first one we'll analyze. And Grace Kelly developed what is called a transatlantic accent, which is a combination of two different kinds of accents, and we'll get into that. I kind of created my own transatlantic Spanish without meaning to. So I had very specific consonant sounds that I would use that came from Spain, and then other consonant sounds that were easier for me from Latin American Spanish that I would use. And it wasn't until I had been in Spain for a year and a half, going on 2 years, that I started to feel like the way I was speaking wasn't really representing me anymore. I felt like I wanted an evolution. I felt like I wanted to take it to the next stage. And because I had studied Spanish phonetics, I knew how to do it because I knew it was a science. So over time, after having the science, I could choose as my stage of authenticity adapted with me. I could change how I wanted to speak and turn it into a habit over time.
Mm-hmm. So there is, yeah, very intentional. It's a very intentional thing for us to work in our voice so that we feel confident, and also thinking about adapting to the audience. So many professionals that are working with native speakers, more, I think this is especially for those who are working with native speakers, because maybe they feel very lost in what is the point of reference from which they can work on their voices and what is kind of the most effective thing for them. Because I think there are a lot of misunderstandings maybe about what is kind of the foundation, or like what are the main aspects you have to work in your voice. And what you say about, I think, being strategic and adapting to your needs. So it's like if you're working in, I imagine, an American company, you're working in tech, and it's a very specific type of environment. Maybe that's kind of, you go to the standard American variation, like a point of reference. But then if you're working all day with these people and they have specific idioms or ways of pronouncing, to what extent do you think it's interesting for us to work on those aspects? In what aspects it can benefit us? It's not going to make us feel we are losing authenticity, So what will be your takes on that? If I am your client and I'm working in this company from San Francisco, I'm in tech, and I want to feel empowered as a leader, and I feel that my English is in the way because I compare myself all the time with native speakers, and my pronunciation is a big issue for me.
You want to prioritize these skills based on the amount of benefit that they're going to bring you. So, for example, if I'm working all with native speakers and I recognize that they use a certain pronunciation, they use a lot of phrasal verbs, they use a lot of idioms, that's a part of their identity. Accent, this is a controversial thing, but I believe it. Accent is identity. The way you speak and the way you represent yourself through your communication, you're showing at different points in time parts of your identity. We speak a certain way because we're from a certain place, or we've had certain experiences, or we've been around certain types of communicators for X amount of time, or we've studied certain things. There's a reason behind why we communicate. So your communication and your accent is linked to what you're showing about your identity. And if there's times where you love that, you feel great with that, that's amazing. That's what we're going for. And there's times when you feel like that doesn't align, and then you want to be able to identify what you want to change. So if I'm speaking with natives and they're not understanding me, or I can feel that there's not like a social connection, like we're not getting along, there's always something like a little forced or not very natural about our interactions. It could be a cultural thing, that's one part, but also the more close we can feel to the way that they pronounce things and how they express themselves, the easier it will be for us to understand them effortlessly without, using all of our brain power to understand. And also people who speak like each other, you feel like you can relate to that person instantaneously because they talk like you. I was at a lunch with a bunch of people in a very noisy restaurant on Saturday. And the table next to us, we were in a touristic spot in Madrid. And the table next to us, there were two older women who were American. Out of all of the noise and all of the background things going on, I immediately knew, oh, there's two Americans right there. Because it pops out something familiar and you're like, that's them. The other day, I was walking down the street in my town. I live in a very small town. And there is an Australian that's here on some sort of exchange with school. And I was walking down the street, and out of all of the noises and the cars and everything, I turned around, and 10 meters behind me, I was like, there he is. There's the Australian, because I could hear it from a mile away. So when people talk like you feel like there's some sort of emotional connection. And that comes from the prehistoric, times of bonding as human beings, communication wise. But then if I'm speaking to someone who, let's say I work with an international team, but all of them are European based and there are no native speakers, maybe then my version of clarity, my idea of clarity is different. Because if we're all using, for example, the same tense vowel sounds, instead of having differentiations between words like least and list, if everyone pronounces it the same, then we'll just figure it out based
know about Monaco?
Well, let me think. I suppose that Monaco has a certain 19th century charm that I think people look for and are happy to find here. It has a lot of sunshine to offer, a lot of nice weather, and I think, well, the whole principality has a great deal of charm, and I think starting with the people, and they're warm and good-hearted and gay, I think.
Anna, I don't know if you noticed anything that was different after thinking about it or us talking about it the last little bit.
Yes, now I was making much more attention, like listening more carefully, and I noticed there were sounds that there were difference in some of the sounds. Like I noticed the interviewer maybe more American standard, and Grace Kelly, there were sounds that were a little bit different, but I couldn't really say which sounds. So it's more like a general impression, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So something we hear from Grace Kelly, first of all, she's very elegant in the sense that like she is very poised, very refined. Everything is like very restrained and very careful. You think about that when you think about royalty speaking. Everything is very medido, no? with how you speak and how you say it. So she has that. But then you really notice that dropping of the R sound that I mentioned that comes from British accents as well. Like she said, Monaco has a charm instead of a charm, right? I would put in that R here instead of here, offer instead of offer, weather instead of weather, weather. So she had that was very consistent in dropping the R's. And then she had other things that were not always consistent, which is the flap T in English. So the flap T is where in American and Canadian accents, and in Australian accents as well, when we have a T between two vowels, we pronounce it like a little D, like a quick D. So she, instead of saying principality, which is what I would say, itty at the end, she said principality, with a very tiny T in there, but she pronounced the T fully. But then in the next two words where she had a flap T that comes after an R vowel, started, good-hearted, instead of saying the flap T, she, or instead of saying the T like she did in principality, here she used the flap T. So started, we would use like a D sound there, and she did that. Good-hearted, did, instead of tid, did. She did the same thing there. So we can see that she has those little elements. And then with vowels, there are a lot of things that happen that are different between her and the interviewer, but she's very soft-spoken as she speaks throughout the whole thing as well. Something that I'll mention from a communication standpoint, not just from the pronunciation side, is about the interviewer actually, and how the interviewer asks her questions. So for any of you that listen to a lot of podcasts, which you probably do if you're here listening, if you are asking specific kinds of questions, you're going to get specific kinds of answers. Meghan Kelly, or Grace Kelly, excuse me. Now I'm thinking of Meghan Markle and Grace Kelly at the same time. So Grace Kelly, she receives a lot of questions that are yes and no questions. So if you watch the whole interview, there's a lot of moments where she gives a very short answer, very polite, the minimum that she needs to say, but she's not going to offer more details than necessary because she was asked a very specific short question. So she's not going to risk making a mistake with how she speaks about the royal family or how she is speaking to the public by adding more details that no one asked, right? She has to preserve the image, right? That's very important. And I actually watched later an interview. It was a very short clip of an interview of the person who was interviewing Grace Kelly. So this was someone that worked for Today, the news channel, and her name was Barbara Walters. This is the interviewer. And Barbara,
I know Barbara Walters from my immersion in American culture, so imagine if she's known because.
Oh, good. Okay, so maybe other people know Barbara Walters too. I didn't know that other people would know, but I'm not surprised that you know who Barbara Walters is.
Yeah.
And she said in a clip when someone asked her about interviewing Grace Kelly, this was years later, she said that she felt that Grace was very, very nervous, and she could feel that during the interview, and that after the interview was finally over, she was ready to like break down in tears. She was very sad, very upset. One of the final questions that she asks in the interview is, "Are you happy? Are you happy?" Also a very direct question to ask, especially with someone who is in that kind of spotlight. If this interviewer, instead of asking, "Are you happy?" in such a direct yes, no way, if she had asked, "How has being princess influenced your happiness?" How much easier would it have been for Grace Kelly to answer that question, thinking that she's not cornered into a yes or no. She has all this room and space to play with it. And us, when we're asking questions to our colleagues, to our managers, to someone that we are interviewing, if we are hiring someone for a role, our friends, if you're asking them questions that corner them into only having a black or white answer, it's so much more difficult if you're in a sensitive situation. And this would be something that I would recommend to the interviewer. If I were her coach in this case, I would say, ask more open-ended questions. Ask things that start with what, with how, instead of yes or no. And if I were Grace Kelly, I would have reformulated her questions as she asked them. And I would have responded by saying, how has this affected my happiness? That's a great question. And I would have changed it intentionally. And that's something that would have benefited both of them. It would have made them more comfortable in the interview. So those are my initial reflections from this little clip with Grace Kelly.
A lot of really interesting takes, like what you were saying about actually when you are answering difficult questions or questions that are trying to make you react in a certain way. I think it's like if you're a skilled communicator, you're gonna go for what is the layer of the question that I want to ask, or I will reformulate it, I will make it so that it works in my favor. But I think you have to be skilled and practice in order to do so. Another question that comes to me is if you just base as if it was a forensic analyst, and that based on the communication of Grace Kelly in this interview, what could you tell about her confidence, her self-worth, like the presence that she has in the way that she works in her voice and the way she answers the questions? Like, what can you tell based on the science of communication of her as the charisma, like as an actress, as a personality?
That's such a hard question. It's so challenging because you need such a holistic perspective of things going on in someone's life to be able to actually analyze what's going on in a concrete moment, which is something that I have actually. I understand that it gets a lot of views, and it's very helpful as well for a lot of people to see analysis of like someone's body language or their communication and what it means about their personality or their psychological state or this and that. We see a lot of those online, right? And they're very interesting, but a lot of times they're taking things without all the context. There's so much context we don't have when we do that. So there's very concrete cases where it does work, and others where it works less, or it's less effective. One thing that I will say that I notice that also was a reflection that Barbara Walters shares is that a lot of actresses and actors, when you interview them outside of being an actor and having a very specific script, it can be a lot harder for them to answer personal questions. They're very used to working with a script and showing their emotion through other characters. So all of a sudden, when the questions are about you, and this is something that I see, I've worked with actors as well who have had the same thing, that when they were preparing for like press tours and they were going to have a lot of media asking them questions, they felt perfectly fine answering questions about their character, about their role. But as soon as they had the question that was about them, they would freeze. And this is the part that they're like, I have to train this because it's not quick, it's not natural, I don't know what to say. They would get blocked. And I can definitely feel, and I think this comes from a lot of people from any very high level of power, authority, royalty, royal families. There's a lot of pressure there to speak a very specific way and answer questions in a very specific way. So you can tell that there are places where she's filling in the holes like after the fact, because she knows that if she doesn't, she will be misinterpreted. So they're always super careful to try and over communicate everything. There's a moment in the interview later where Barbara Walters asks her, you know, what is the prince like? Because the prince was someone who's much more reserved and didn't really talk a lot. People didn't see him a lot in the media. So she wanted to know how Grace would describe her husband. And she described a lot of things about him as a father, and he's an amazing father, and he's great with the kids, and he's so present, and an amazing husband too, of course. Like, so it's like she adds it as an afterthought, maybe not because she thinks she wants to, or maybe she thinks that she shouldn't have to say it, that obviously he's a good husband. Like, it could be read both ways, but either way, she knows that if she doesn't add it, someone is going to say something about her husband, the prince, that's going to come back badly on her. And she does say as well that she's very, she was hurt by perceptions in the media that people would say of her treating badly members of, the presidential family from the US when they would take trips to France or Monaco. And there was a bit of a scandal of someone saying that she didn't treat someone right. And she was very upset by it. And she said, I don't know where that came from. And I was very personally, hurt by that comment. So all of these things that we come to conclusions about that are impacting other people's lives. There's something really interesting that happens in one of Meghan Markle's interviews at the very end of a longer one that I watched that speaks to this point, this frustration that many
she's very the presence. Like there is an aspect of being in the present that you notice that it's curious that you say that Barbara Walters noticed that she was nervous. You didn't get that when you listen to her. She seems very composed and like, I'm here flowing in this interview, like I'm in the pool.
And that goes to show how important the context is, because all these things that Barbara Walters must have seen before and during and after, and I'm sure that the interview was actually longer than that, and they probably cut out different clips. There's so much more that goes into it that if you don't see it and you're not there in someone's presence, it's so hard to make judgments. You know, all we can do is
I mean, how... Can you imagine? No, I'm not a singer. I think what's been really exciting as we talk about the transition of this out of my career but into the role is that, as you said, the causes that have been very important to me I can focus even more energy on, because very early out of the gate I think you realize once you have access or a voice that people are willing to listen to, with that comes a lot of responsibility, which I take seriously. And at the same time, I think in these beginning few months and now being boots on the ground in the UK, I'm excited to just really get to know more about the different communities here, smaller organizations who are working on the same causes that I've always been passionate about under this umbrella. And also being able to go around to the Commonwealth. I think it's just the beginning of a...
There's a lot to do. There's a lot to do.
And it's an immense change. You're getting a new country out of it, a husband, obviously, but also giving up your career.
This is nice. Yes. But I don't see it as giving anything up. I just see it as a change.
It's a new challenge.
It's a new chapter, right? And also keep in mind, I've been working on my show for 7 years. No one's ever asked me that. What a great question. The one thing, oh gosh, what's the one thing? Oh gosh, I think that when I sit with it for a second here, I just want people to know that I'm a real person. And I think a lot of that gets lost in what can be super dehumanizing when you look at the clickbait culture and how much is written about someone. It's like, no, my friends have to read those things. Like, I have real best friends, the same ones since I was 17. Like, I'm a real mom. I choose to go and do school pickup and drop off, but I do that under a landscape that is created that forgets that I'm a real person. And how would you want someone to treat a real person in your life that you cared about or loved or respected? And so there's something about that, I think, that often gets lost. And even though earlier I was saying you can compartmentalize, like I say, that's a caricature. Yes, but my kids will see those magazines, and we all know moms gossip. And so I have to make a choice to move through the world as myself in spite of all the noise that's created. But maybe there would be less noise if people remembered that I'm a real person.